There are places on this earth where death refuses to be forgotten, where the very air tastes of copper and salt, where shadows move with the weight of memories that should have been buried centuries ago. Tonight, we're going to one of those places. We're going to meet a man who didn't just embrace darkness, he became it. But first, let me ask you something that will haunt you long after this video ends. What happens when a human being realizes that fear is the only currency that truly matters? What happens when someone discovers that the line between legend and monster isn't drawn by others, but by the choices we make when no one is watching? Picture this. November 22nd, 1718. The waters off Ocracoke Island are black as ink, and somewhere in that darkness a man is dying. Not just any death, but a death so violent, so prolonged, that even his enemies will later whisper about it in hushed tones. 25 wounds, 5 gunshot holes, blood mixing with seawater. And through it all, this man, this legend, keeps fighting, keeps roaring, keeps proving that some people are simply too stubborn to die quietly. But here's what they don't tell you in the history books. In his final moments, as consciousness slipped away like water through his fingers, Edward Teach, Blackbeard, realized something that would make even the devil himself pause. Something about the nature of existence that we're going to explore tonight. Something that will change how you see not just pirates, but life itself. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Before we dive into that blood-soaked finale, we need to understand how a man becomes a myth, how a myth becomes a monster, and how a monster becomes something far worse, a reflection of every dark impulse that humanity tries to hide. If you're ready to question everything you thought you knew about good and evil, about the thin veneer of civilization that separates us from chaos, then hit that subscribe button. Because the stories I tell here don't just entertain, they reveal truths about human nature that most people spend their entire lives trying to avoid. Trust me, after tonight you'll see the world differently. The year is 1680. Somewhere in Bristol, England, a child is born into a world that doesn't care whether he lives or dies. Edward Teach, though that might not even be his real name, because in those days identity was as fluid as the tide, grows up breathing the stench of unwashed bodies, rotting fish, and something else. Something that clings to port cities like a second skin: desperation. Can you smell it? That acrid mixture of hope and hopelessness that permeates every dock, every tavern, every narrow alley where men make deals that cost them their souls. Bristol was a gateway to the New World, but it was also a graveyard for dreams. Young Edward would have walked these streets, seen the broken men stumbling out of alehouses, heard the stories of fortunes made and lost across the ocean, felt the weight of poverty pressing down like a physical thing. But here's where the story becomes something more than just another tale of poverty breeding crime. Edward Teach possessed something that most desperate men lacked: imagination. Not the kind that dreams of better days, but the kind that understands exactly how fear works, how it spreads through a crowd like wildfire, how it can be weaponized, cultivated, perfected. By the time he reached manhood, Teach had already learned the most important lesson of his life. People will give you anything: their money, their loyalty, their very souls, if you can make them believe that the alternative is something worse than death. The Caribbean in the early 1700s was a place where the normal rules of civilization simply didn't apply. Imagine islands where the air shimmers with heat and violence, where every sunset might be your last, where the difference between merchant and pirate often came down to nothing more than opportunity and desperation. The War of Spanish Succession had just ended, leaving thousands of experienced sailors unemployed, trained in the arts of war, but with no legitimate outlet for their skills. These weren't romanticized adventurers seeking treasure. They were predators, pure and simple, men who had looked into the abyss of human nature and decided to make it their home. This is where Edward Teach shed his old identity like a snake sheds its skin. This is where he became something else entirely. Working under Captain Benjamin Hornigold, Teach learned that piracy wasn't just about stealing gold, it was about creating a persona so terrifying that resistance became unthinkable. He studied fear like a scholar studies books, understanding its nuances, its pressure points, its devastating effectiveness when properly applied. And slowly, methodically, he began to construct the identity that would outlive his mortal body by centuries: Blackbeard. The transformation wasn't just physical, though the physical aspects were horrifying enough. Teach let his beard grow wild and long, weaving hemp and slow-burning fuses into the black tangle, so that smoke would literally rise from his face during battle. But think about what that means for a moment. Picture yourself face to face with a man whose head appears to be on fire, whose eyes burn through that supernatural haze, whose very presence seems to violate the natural order of things. The psychological impact was immediate and devastating. Sailors would later describe seeing Blackbeard as being confronted by the devil himself, and perhaps they weren't entirely wrong. But here's what makes Blackbeard truly terrifying from an existential standpoint. He understood that human beings are fundamentally alone in the universe, that all our social conventions, our laws, our morality, are just thin constructs designed to help us forget that fundamental isolation. And he used that understanding as a weapon. When Blackbeard appeared on the horizon, he wasn't just threatening to steal cargo or take lives, he was forcing people to confront the reality that everything they believed about safety, about order, about their place in the world, was nothing more than a comforting illusion. Do you understand what I'm saying? Can you feel it? That creeping realization that the difference between civilization and chaos is nothing more than consensus, a shared agreement that can be shattered by a single man with enough will and imagination. Blackbeard didn't just rob ships, he robbed people of their fundamental assumptions about how the world worked. And that, perhaps, was his greatest cruelty. By 1717, Blackbeard had acquired his most famous vessel, the Queen Anne's Revenge, a former French slave ship that he transformed into a floating nightmare. 300 tons of terror, armed with 40 cannons and crewed by the damned. Can you imagine walking through the lower decks of that ship? The stench of gunpowder and unwashed bodies, the creak of timber under the weight of artillery, the constant, oppressive knowledge that you were trapped in a floating prison with men who had crossed every moral boundary that society had ever established. The Queen Anne's Revenge wasn't just a ship, it was a manifestation of chaos itself, a physical representation of what happens when human beings abandon all pretense of civilization. And it was on this ship that Blackbeard perfected his greatest psychological weapon: uncertainty. His crew never knew when their captain might suddenly turn violent, when a casual conversation might become a death sentence, when loyalty might be rewarded with a cutlass to the throat. He cultivated an atmosphere of constant tension, a state where every moment carried the possibility of sudden, arbitrary death. This wasn't cruelty for its own sake. This was a carefully calculated strategy designed to ensure absolute control through the manipulation of fear. Would you have been able to survive in such an environment? Could you have maintained your sanity while constantly wondering if your next breath might be your last? Could you have looked into those smoke-wreathed eyes every morning and pretended to be loyal, while knowing that loyalty itself was just another currency to be spent when convenient? These aren't just historical questions. They're mirrors reflecting the darkest aspects of human nature, the parts of ourselves that we prefer not to examine too closely. The spring of 1718 brought Blackbeard's most audacious act of psychological warfare: the blockade of Charleston, South Carolina. For nearly a week, he held an entire city hostage, not for gold or silver, but for a chest of medicine. Think about the implications of that. Here was a man so powerful, so feared, that he could essentially declare war on an entire colonial settlement and hold its siege until his demands were met. The message was clear: no one was safe, no community too large, no authority too established to be immune from his reach. But Charleston was also where the cracks in Blackbeard's empire began to show. Success, it seems, breeds its own form of destruction. With wealth came complacency, with fear came isolation, and with power came the inevitable realization that even devils must eventually face judgment. The colonial authorities were beginning to organize, to coordinate their responses, to understand that Blackbeard's greatest weapon, fear itself, could be turned against him if enough people were willing to stand together and say, "No more." Governor Alexander Spotswood of Virginia had been watching, studying, planning. Unlike Blackbeard's other enemies, Spotswood understood that you cannot fight a legend with conventional weapons. You cannot defeat fear with force alone. You need something more primal, more fundamental. You need to prove that monsters can bleed, that devils can die, that the natural order of things will ultimately reassert itself. And so, he began to plan what would become one of the most violent and desperate battles in the history of American piracy. But I'm getting ahead of myself again. Before we reach that blood-soaked finale, we need to understand what was happening inside Blackbeard's mind during those final months. Because here's the thing about building your identity around fear. Eventually, you begin to fear yourself. You begin to wonder if the monster you've created has consumed the human being you once were. You begin to question whether you're still in control, or whether you've become a prisoner of your own legend. Think about it. Every morning, Edward Teach had to wake up and put on the mask of Blackbeard. Every morning, he had to weave those fuses into his beard, arm himself for battle, cultivate that aura of supernatural malevolence that kept his crew in line and his enemies paralyzed with fear. But what happens to a human soul when it spends years pretending to be a demon? What happens to the mind when it lives constantly in a state of performance? When authenticity becomes impossible because the authentic self has been buried so deep beneath layers of calculated terror that even you can't find it anymore. By late 1718, those closest to Blackbeard began to notice changes. The calculated brutality remained, but underneath it was something new. A kind of desperate intensity, as if he was trying to convince himself as much as others that the legend was real. The psychological pressure of maintaining such an extreme persona for so long was beginning to take its toll. Like an actor who has played the same role for so long that he can no longer remember who he was before the performance began, Blackbeard was becoming trapped inside his own creation. And perhaps that's what makes his final battle so profoundly disturbing. Because when Lieutenant Robert Maynard finally cornered him in the shallow waters off Ocracoke Island on that November morning, Blackbeard didn't just face the prospect of death, he faced the possibility of revelation. What if, in his final moments, the mask finally slipped? What if Edward Teach emerged from behind the legend of Blackbeard, only to discover that there was nothing left of the man he had once been? The battle itself lasted only minutes, but those minutes contained enough violence and desperation to fuel nightmares for generations. Maynard had come prepared for war, with 2 sloops and a crew of experienced fighters who understood that they weren't just fighting a man, they were fighting a symbol, an idea that had to be destroyed completely, or it would continue to spread like a plague through the colonial imagination. Picture the scene. Shallow water reflecting the gray November sky, the air thick with gunpowder smoke and the screams of dying men, blood turning the sea around them into something that looked like liquid rust. Blackbeard, his famous fuses still smoking from his beard, cutlass in hand, refusing to surrender even as his ship was overwhelmed, even as his crew fell around him, even as it became clear that this was not a battle he could win. But still, he fought, because surrender would mean admitting that the legend was nothing more than a man. And men can be broken, humiliated, made to beg for mercy. And so he chose death. Not because he was brave, but because he was terrified of what would remain if the performance ever stopped. 25 wounds they found on his body later. 5 gunshot wounds and 20 cuts from sword and knife. Can you imagine the determination it would take to keep fighting through that kind of damage? Can you comprehend the psychological state of a man so committed to maintaining his legend that he would endure that level of agony rather than admit defeat? But here's the truly horrifying part. Even in death, Blackbeard got the last laugh. Maynard severed his head and hung it from his ship's bowsprit as proof that the devil could indeed be killed. But in doing so, he inadvertently completed Blackbeard's transformation from man to myth. The severed head became a symbol more powerful than the living person had ever been. It said to everyone who saw it, "This is what happens to legends. They don't fade away, they become eternal." And that brings us to the most disturbing question of all. Who was Edward Teach, really? Was he a man who became a monster? Or was he a monster who briefly pretended to be a man? The historical record gives us facts, dates, locations, actions, but it can't answer the fundamental question of identity. What we're left with is something far more unsettling: the realization that identity itself might be nothing more than a performance, a mask we wear so consistently that we forget there was ever a face underneath. The waters off Ocracoke Island still remember that November morning. Fishermen sometimes report strange experiences there. Equipment that fails without explanation, compass needles that spin wildly, a sense of being watched by something that shouldn't exist. Local legends claim that on foggy nights you can still see the outline of a ship with smoking rigging, still hear the sound of battle echoing across the water. But I think the real ghost isn't Blackbeard himself. It's the question he forces us to confront about the nature of identity, about the masks we all wear, about the moment when performance becomes reality and reality becomes performance. Because here's what Blackbeard understood that most of us refuse to acknowledge. We're all performing versions of ourselves every single day. The only difference is that most of us perform normalcy, conformity, the comfortable lie that we're good people living in an ordered world. Blackbeard chose to perform chaos, to strip away the pretenses and show people what lurks beneath the surface of human civilization. And maybe that's why his legend persists, not because he was evil, but because he was honest about the evil that exists in all of us. The psychological implications of Blackbeard's story extend far beyond piracy or even history. They touch on fundamental questions about human nature that philosophers and psychologists have grappled with for centuries. What happens when someone fully embraces their shadow self? What occurs when the civilized mask is not just removed, but systematically destroyed? Blackbeard's transformation from Edward Teach to legend represents a complete psychological metamorphosis, one that challenges our basic assumptions about identity, morality, and the thin line that separates order from chaos. Consider the crew members who served under him, men who witnessed firsthand the complete abandonment of moral restraint. What did it do to their psyches to live in constant proximity to someone who had crossed every line that society draws to contain human behavior? Some historical accounts suggest that many of his crew members suffered from what we would now recognize as symptoms of severe psychological trauma: an inability to readjust to normal society, persistent nightmares, a disconnection from their own emotions that made them seem almost inhuman to those who knew them before their time with Blackbeard. This raises a disturbing possibility. What if exposure to absolute moral chaos is itself a form of contagion? What if witnessing the complete breakdown of civilized behavior doesn't just horrify us but actually awaken something dark and primitive within us? Blackbeard didn't just command through fear. He commanded through a kind of psychological infection that spread through his crew like a disease, transforming them from ordinary men into something else entirely. And what about us, the people who continue to be fascinated by his story 3 centuries later? What does it say about human nature that we're drawn to tales of such complete moral abandonment? Why do we find ourselves simultaneously repelled and attracted by the idea of someone who lived entirely without constraints, who rejected every social norm and moral boundary that we ourselves accept without question? Perhaps it's because, deep down, we recognize something of ourselves in Blackbeard's story. Not the violence or the cruelty, but the fantasy of complete freedom from the expectations and limitations that define our daily lives. The places where Blackbeard operated still carry traces of his presence, not just in the historical record, but in the collective unconscious of the communities that remember him. Bath, North Carolina, where he briefly attempted to retire from piracy, maintains an atmosphere that locals describe as heavy, as if the very air is saturated with memories of violence and moral transgression. Visitors often report feeling watched, followed, judged by some invisible presence that seems to emanate from the shadows themselves. But it's Ocracoke Island where the psychological residue is strongest, where the most chilling encounters occur. The inlet where Blackbeard made his final stand has become a kind of psychological landmark, a place where the normal rules of reality seem slightly bent, where the past refuses to stay buried, where the boundary between legend and reality becomes disturbingly permeable. Local fishing guide Tommy Westcott has worked these waters for 37 years, and he's seen things that have made him question his own sanity. In October 2019, he was guiding a small charter boat through the inlet just after sunset when his GPS started spinning wildly, and his depth finder began reading impossible measurements, showing the water alternating between 3 feet and 300 feet deep in the same spot. That's when he saw it. A figure standing on the bow of what appeared to be an old sailing vessel, maybe 200 yards away. The figure was tall, imposing, with long dark hair whipping in a wind that Tommy couldn't feel on his own boat. Most disturbing of all were the small points of light flickering around the figure's head, like sparks or burning embers dancing in the darkness. Tommy tried to radio the Coast Guard, but all he got was static. When he looked back, the ship was gone, but the smell lingered, gunpowder and rotting wood and something else, something that reminded him of a slaughterhouse. His passengers saw it too. 3 different people, 3 different accounts, but all describing the same impossible sight. Is this real, or is it simply the power of legend to shape perception? Does it matter? The psychological impact is the same regardless of the objective reality. Blackbeard has transcended history and become something more fundamental, a representation of the chaos that lurks just beneath the surface of ordered existence, a reminder that civilization is always just one man's will away from collapse. Would you walk alone through the marshes of Ocracoke Island on a foggy November night? Would you trust your senses if you saw something that shouldn't exist moving through the mist? Would you be able to convince yourself that it was just imagination, just the power of suggestion, just your mind playing tricks on you? Or would you recognize, in that moment of primal terror, that some stories are too powerful to be contained by mere facts? That some legends have achieved a kind of psychological reality that makes them more real than reality itself? The truth about Edward Teach, Blackbeard, is that he understood something about human psychology that most of us spend our entire lives trying to avoid. That we are all capable of monstrous acts. That the difference between hero and villain is often nothing more than circumstance and choice. that the moral frameworks we use to organize our lives are fragile constructs that can be shattered by a single moment of perfect clarity about the true nature of existence. He didn't just become a pirate, he became a mirror, reflecting back to humanity its own darkest possibilities. And perhaps that's why his story continues to haunt us centuries later. Not because we're fascinated by violence or criminality, but because we recognize, in Blackbeard's complete transformation from man to monster, a possibility that exists within all of us. We see in his legend a warning about what happens when someone fully embraces their shadow self, when they stop pretending to be civilized and allow their truest, darkest nature to emerge without restraint. The final irony of Blackbeard's story is that in trying to escape the constraints of human society, he became trapped in an even more restrictive prison, the prison of his own legend. Edward Teach died that November morning in 1718, but Blackbeard became immortal, condemned to exist forever as a symbol of human darkness, a reminder that beneath every civilized exterior lurks the potential for absolute chaos. In seeking ultimate freedom, he achieved the ultimate imprisonment. And so we return to that question I asked at the beginning. What happens when a human being realizes that fear is the only currency that truly matters? The answer, I think, is that they stop being human. They become something else entirely, not a person, but a force, not a man, but a manifestation of the darkness that exists at the core of human existence. They become a legend that will outlive every person who remembers their real name, a story that will be told long after the historical facts have been forgotten, a symbol of everything we fear about ourselves and everything we're capable of becoming if we ever stop believing in the possibility of redemption.